In the last video, I covered the basics of auto layout, but honestly, springs and struts using auto resizing mask was pretty good back in the olden days. The only weakness really was dealing with labels, and so, or like that was for the everyday use case, right? There's always fancier things. Like for example, if I rotate this, um, you know, right now in springs and struts, the choices are kind of like, well, you can grow it with the width or you can center it. But sometimes you might want something in between, right? Like you might want it to change the margins. And so there was a level of control that you couldn't quite accomplish with springs and struts. And so what would happen is people would just redo things manually. And that's the reason that people hated Interface Builder back in the day, because, and you know, still today, but like it was really historical, which was, you know, it used to be very, very manual. Like let's say that if I rotate this and I wanted to increase the margins, well, you couldn't use springs and struts anymore. And so what you would do is on the rotation, you would manually tweak these margin values and just set them to whatever you wanted them to be. So often you'd have to recalculate all the geometry just yourself. And the advantage over layout-based, flow-based layout stuff is this was very, very fast, very, very performant. But the weakness from a development perspective was that it was very laborious or labor intensive to kind of go through. And I mean, imagine you had to do this in the web. I mean, as if I'm resizing my browser, I have to run through every part of the screen and just like recalculate everyone's X, Y, width, and height manually. So for the ordinary use case, though, auto resizing mask worked great. But the thing it could not handle very well or at all was labels. And so, like, let's say that, for example, this block, this white rectangle here, this is not actually a rectangle in a post. This is actually a label, right? Like, this is some label that's here. Let me change the color of it so we can see it. So just make it white. So I would have this label here. And if I want this, I would want the size of this post to flow with this text. And I would want this label to wrap, something as simple as that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an outlet to this label, and I'm just going to give it some text. So this will just be, you know, my text label. And then in my view did load, I'll just copy this text here. Text label dot text is equal to. So give it some wrapping text there. And let's just run this without any configuration and see what happens. So the default behavior, if you don't do any work, is that it's going to keep the initial frame that you set, but it's going to crop it. So that's not necessarily what I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to bring in auto layout to help things for me. I'm going to use my TIE Fighter here, and I'm going to specify margins here. Notice that now for the first time, as I click this drop down, there's multiple options here. There's the profile picture here that's 8 pixels away from me, or I can go for my parent, which is 77 pixels away from me. So this looks good, and I'm going to add these left and top constraints. And I can see that it's a little bit unhappy, it's ambiguous. And that's because, well, my top position is with respect to this profile picture, but this has no constraints on it. And so this has an ambiguous Y position, and therefore this will also have an ambiguous Y position. So I have to go to my profile picture and specify, well, I want it to be 8 away from this little story or post container. And I want it to have a fixed width and height, which is normal for profile pictures. Profile pictures don't usually change. So I'm going to add those constraints, and everything's blue again. So the first thing that I notice that's odd from auto layout is even though I only specify the X and the Y, I noticed that normally if I'd done that for this view, for example, it would have been unhappy, it would have been orange. In this case though, it's blue. And the reason why is because there's one more concept with auto layout, which is there's a notion of intrinsic size. And so these views have no intrinsic size, but labels have an intrinsic size that fits its content. And so even though there's no width and height specified by nature, it's going to try to fit to size the content, and so it'll fall back to that to tell the system what the size is. Now, when you're working with labels, the first thing that you have to do, so you might have like been messing with your layout here, and you maybe tinkered it to some size. You should always size to fit the content in the label. It's auto layout's a little bit finicky sometimes, and that's one area that I've noticed that it doesn't handle well. Before you add any rules to labels, always go through and make sure that you size it to fit. You size it to fit by hitting the Command equals button. So Command equals will bring it back to fit the current size that you're working with. So let's see what this natural behavior is. So let's see if it kind of does for free what I want. And so the first thing that I notice is that it no longer crops, but it just kind of runs off the screen. So I'm going to come to this label, and I'm going to configure one of the properties here. So one of the properties is this thing called lines, or if you're changing this in code, it's called number of lines, and I can see that it's currently set to 1. So if I set it to 2 lines, then it'll go up to 2 lines, and then it'll start truncating, or 3 or 4. Or if I wanted to just say, hey, keep on growing with no limit, then make it 0. So just wrap it to as much content as we have. So I'm going to run this again, and hopefully we'll see some wrapping. And so I see there's not, right? And so the reason why is you have to ask yourself, well, where do you want it to wrap? Right? Well, I guess when it reaches the end of the screen. But with what padding? In some case you want it to wrap only to like right here and start going down here. So the thing is, because the wrap width is ambiguous, it just grows the width until it's sizes to fit. And so there's 2 ways. It's somehow you have to set the width. So you can set the width in 2 ways. You can choose some arbitrary width right here. So this is the one time where you can break the size to content fit rule. And then instead specify some fixed width. So it's back to blue again. And now if I run this, then at that wrap width, it's going to begin to grow my text. And if I want to say, well, I don't want it to kind of have a fixed width, I want it to just have some padding associated with this container. So I'm going to specify a right margin. I'll turn that blue again. And then maybe it does what I expect. And I can kind of make this behave like I expect. I can change this. I can delete this height of this container, if I can get to it, and instead make the height something related to this thing here. So I'm going to set this to say whatever padding you want. Like, let's give it some bottom padding of 20. And then I want to update my frame to match my rules. And then if I run this, then as I change this, it should kind of resize my view. So you can see that it's doing that, right? It's because this went from I guess 3 lines to 2, then it kind of tucked it up a little bit, and it preserved this 20 margin with the bottom. So even this already, we've gone like if I had done this in code in the olden days without auto layout, it would be really annoying just to accomplish even this simple feature. And so if I wanted to get a little bit fancier and say delete this rule and then just add another label below it. Like I used to hate labels interacting with each other when it was manually laid out. So even something as simple as this, where I would say specify this, to whatever it is that you want, and run this, and have this first label push down that second label. This is already miracles for me. So let me establish that constraint with the bottom here to kind of before it was cropping it. So now I can see it's all pushing down. So that's the basic of label usage, and that's pretty straightforward. So the challenge with labels is that vertically stacked labels are pretty straightforward. But let's say that you had a situation where all of the complexity with labels comes when there's like horizontally adjacent labels. So for example, if I were to have my name here, so it's not going to be this white bar, it's going to be my name. And if this was a real post, then there's probably like some kind of timestamp as well, right? So it's probably some small font, and then again, always do command equals to fit the size of the labels before you start configuring it. And then this is maybe a little bit too small. And then so this situation, right? Is already a little bit more complex. So let's just try to add the rules that we think it should be. So here I have my top and my left. And then here I want this to stay pinned to the right. Right? As this grows, it kind of makes sense. I want this to be right aligned. So no warnings, no problems. If I hit run, then this kind of goes to the right hand side and it's all good. So the problem comes into play. You probably already are guessing. But if I take this label, create an outlet for it, this is going to be my name label. And then let's say that my name label is something like that. And so if I run this, then I can see that these two labels are going to start to collide. So what you want to do is you want to establish a constraint between these two. And so like, let's say that I'm like, okay, well, I'll kind of create a constraint here. So I add this constraint. And if I hit run, first of all, I see that there's a warning. And it, does something, but it's not quite what I want it to do. So date frames. What I'd like to do is I'd like to say, well, make this like a distance of something like 8. So make sure there's always a distance of at least 8 here. And I can see that it's complaining. It's not really happy with what's going on. And the reason why is because, well, it's recognizing that it's not a distance of 8 right now. It's a distance of, 56, I guess. And that distance is going to change depending on because I want this text to be expanding, both labels to be expanding. So then I use another feature of constraints, which is if I click on the constraint itself, I actually notice that you can choose the relationships. You can even do some goofy things like changing the multiplier. So this is kind of getting into you having access to the actual linear equation itself, y is equal to ax plus b. But for us, all we want to do is we want to change the relationship. We want to say greater than or equal to. And all of a sudden it's happy again. So what this is saying is that this is actually a flexible bar, and it's gonna get smaller, but up until the point where it's 8. And once it's 8, it becomes like this rigid bar. So if I hit run, then it's going to do this, which is maybe not quite what I expected. So the first thing that you do whenever you hit situations like this is you check to make sure there's no auto layout warnings. So I'm going to expand out my layer views. And I'm going to see that, and this kind of weird stuff happens all the time with labels. where it has like some expected X value and then some actual X. So I don't necessarily always trust these, especially with respect to labels. But I'm gonna kind of update, I guess, the frames to make it happy, and then I'm gonna run this again. And I'm gonna see that it's still kind of has this behavior. And so the problem is if you think about it, when there's a lot of rules in play here, including the width of these things, right? So as these are running into each other, you have to ask yourself, well, what do you want to happen, right? There's a number of possibilities. I can start to wrap this name, I can truncate this, or I can truncate that, right? So there's at least three options, even in this really simple scenario. And so I need to somehow convey to auto layout like what I want to happen. And so let's say that I want it to start truncating my name, right? So that's what Twitter does, for example. And I don't want to truncate the timestamp, so I'm going to truncate the name instead. So the way that I specify this is it's two goofy properties. And there's goofy because they're crazy sounding. So one is content hugging priority, and the other is content compression resistance priority. So understanding these two things is a little bit non-intuitive. So remember how we said earlier that labels have an intrinsic notion of size? So this kind of expresses that preference. One is that if the content is smaller than the label, then it likes the frame of the label to snugly fit the content. So that's called content hugging. And kind of vice or the opposite, where as my name gets longer, it doesn't want to truncate my name, so it's going to try to grow the size of the label, and that's compression resistance. So when I want to say that this has a stronger priority than this, then I have to say make sure that the compression resistance of this label is stronger than the compression resistance of this label. In other words, prefer truncating this over truncating that. And so in order to do that, you see this number 751. I would just notch this up one by saying, hey, this is slightly more important not to compress the content of this label when compared to this label. And so if I were to run this again, then I would see that this label now appears. And so you might be asking yourself, why 750? Why 751? Why not 752? Why not 753? In fact, this number can go from 0 to 1,000. So it's kind of arbitrary. So the only thing that matters is 1,000 or less than 1,000. So 1,000 means that it's a required constraint, which means that if I can't meet it exactly, it's going to throw that exception that we saw before. Anything less than 1,000, it means that it's a constraint that you should try your best to match, and then if you fail, well, then just minimize the error. So how do you choose between 0 to 999 then? So the thing is that like this number only matters in this type of situation where there's some kind of you're trying to resolve something between like 1, 2, or 3 views. So I like to just keep it really simple. I like to use only 2 values, max 3 values, and I'll just nudge it up 1. It's kind of like, why does z-index? Z-index can be anything, right? Except that as long as it's all with respect to its neighbors. So the other thing that I might want to do is I might want my name to wrap here. So if I were to take this name label and try to increase the number of lines, or I'll just keep on letting it wrap to 0. Let's see what happens. So in this case, it'll respect the 8 margin and then realize that it needs to wrap, and so then it won't truncate either label. And so for Twitter, it's one kind of step more complex, where it'll be a name, a username, and then a timestamp. So you'll have to kind of negotiate that complexity. So that's it. That's how you work with labels, and that's how you have to work with like fun little properties called content hugging, content compression, and inequality constraints is your toolkit for working with labels.